Yes.
Yes.
All right, cool. Well, like I said, this is a lot better than looking at me anyways. But anyways, good evening, everybody, or like you'd mentioned, if you're in the central time zone like me, good night. It's 9 o'clock here, and I'm on coffee number three today. We have an 18-month-old and a 2-month-old, and I have a business I run too. So if I start nodding off, somebody just snap or something like that. But um, for those of you who don't know me, yeah, my name's Tanner. I took over Harold's prophecy letter. I'm an unamended Christadelphian in the southern Missouri area.
Oh,
Um, and For any of you who read the prophecy letter, a lot of this is going to be very familiar. I feel like I write the same exact thing all the time because all the stuff that's going on, but there's so many things developing that you kind of need to stay up to date with it. But one thing we're going to be talking tonight about is you might have been misled. It was, I think, listed as the conquered earth. As you can see, we're going to talk about subduing the earth, and um, the conquered earth would seem to talk about the events once the kingdom age is kind of fully in swing, once the nations have been conquered, the kind of Solomon phase of Christ begins. But what we're actually going to be talking about is the process of conquering. And it's usually a subject which is one of a lot of excitement for the household, um, because it's something that we'll take part in, and it's the realization of our hope. But the return of Christ itself is a first principle, and like all other first principles, it has heavy ramifications on every other principle, like a domino effect. And this particular subject, which we're going to talk about tonight, gets to the why Jesus is returning. And we'll see why that's an important thing. And I know we did start a few minutes late. I thought I was being good. I was on it like 15, 20 minutes early. I was just waiting and waiting. So sorry about that. But One of the reasons Christ is returning is obviously because man's hope doesn't lie in the mystic golden gates, pearly streets, all that stuff, heavens like modern Christendom teaches. It's here on this planet. This is where the problem is. This is where the problem needs to be fixed. And we know man obviously reigns in this earth when sin is without restraint. And it even says in the scripture that even the whole creation groaneth together in travail and awaits Christ's return, because what will initiate when he returns is the restoration or the recreation of Eden, or really it's better than Eden, but this is all the process and purpose of restoration. It's returning. I mean, the word religion itself means to bind again, which means that at one point they were bound together. So, um, but this is the work of the second Adam, or Christ. I think is actually the fulfilling of the very first task which was ever given to man. And this is something that I thought was fully completed, even as it is today. But it's in Genesis 1:28 where it says that man should replenish the earth, to subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the fowl of the air, and over every living thing that moveth upon the earth. And we look at that and we're like, well, yeah, man's obviously kind of top of the food chain. So that's true. And in many ways, I think it is. But if you read what Paul and the psalmist have to say about it, specifically, it's Psalm chapter 8, Hebrews 2, verse 8, and then 1 Corinthians 15:25. They show that this is not fully done yet. There's work to be done, and this will be completed by the second Adam. So when he returns, there's a lot that is going to go on. Much of it, obviously, we're not even going to talk about, like the actual cleansing of Israel itself, how the nations are going to come up and worship and learn. There will be a highway that runs from Egypt to Assyria to bring the Jews back. Or I mean, even the potential realignment of the continents themselves. A lot of wonderful stuff I'd love to talk about. We just don't have time tonight to do it. So with only two classes, I think even two classes isn't enough to really do justice to the conquering aspect, but we'll work with what we got. But Our comments are based on, well, actually, let me say this first. If you're wondering what on earth this figure with the sword coming out of his mouth is, many of you probably are aware, but Revelation being the most symbolic book in the Bible, this is a symbolic way of showing Christ conquering. So we'll explain that a little bit more in a bit, but I don't want to leave anybody confused. But we're basing our comments on Revelation 11:15, and this oops, sorry, I knocked my microphone down. This photo, I had to edit the wings off this angel because we know angels don't have wings. But look at this as Christ in the political heavens on the earth when this is fulfilled. And this is the seventh angel sounding the last last trumpet, and there were great voices in heaven saying, "The kingdoms of this world are become the kingdoms of our Lord and of his Christ, and he shall reign forever and ever." Now, this kingdom, we know the borders of the kingdom itself, because these are the borders of the land promised to Abraham, that he and his seed, which is specifically Christ, would inherit those things forever. And we know that this kingdom is actually going to spread and cover the entire earth. We can kind of call it the empire of Christ. But how is that going to be accomplished? And that's what we're going to look at tonight. And obviously, with prophecy in particular, there's a lot of different views on what's going to happen, particularly in relation to what some of the pioneer brethren thought. But obviously, we're familiar with the passage as it says that no prophecy is of private interpretation, and there's only one way that things are actually going to happen. And I seriously doubt that anybody has all of the details worked out, but I do believe that we can figure out at least the general sequence of these things. And I say that with a lot of, I don't use the term reserve, but I mean that because I ask a lot of questions, and it takes a lot for me to believe something or looking into it myself, but I really think that we can discern these things well, and that's why they were given to us. But what we're going to do tonight is go about how Christ is going to conquer the earth. And what we'll see is that it starts in Jerusalem and expands outwardly from there. And eventually, like I said, it'll cover every part of the planet. But before we really get into the nitty-gritty stuff, we kind of got to lay down some preliminary things. And just two quick things on this is, one is that, things are always happening in the earth. There's lots going on, and events aren't isolated from each other. Real events are always, interacting and responding to one another. So, for example, we look at Russia and Ukraine, but that's being impacted by what's going on with Israel and these Arab nations. It's being impacted by, China and Taiwan. I mean, there's all these things that are kind of all moving together at one piece in respect to one another. And I think when we look at some of the older thoughts on prophecies, this aspect is forgotten, but I don't think it's going to be any different in the age to come. So, and I think when we know that, we can actually see some of these moving parts in the prophecies themselves. But another thing we know is that this is not the first time the land of promise has been conquered. I think it'll be the first time it was conquered completely. But we know that in the days of Moses and Joshua, Israel was brought to the land promised to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. It was not a different land. I went through and I didn't even remember how many times it says it, but specifically, it's the land that was promised to those three fathers. And it was basically a shadow of Christ's conquering of the land. Joshua is the same exact name as Jesus. It's just the Hebrew version of it. And we know Joshua, in many respects, is a figure of Christ. And I think the same can be said of how they would conquer the land. And we'll kind of see some of that tonight, which was when I read some of these things myself, it's kind of made the hair on my neck stand up. But when they came into the land before, it wasn't just, go in and take it. There were principles for doing this, and certain things were to be handled certain ways. And one of the important things we'll look at here is Deuteronomy 20, specifically verses 10 through 17. And I try to put as many things up on the screen here as possible, but if you can open your Bibles, it obviously works better that way. But Deuteronomy 20, 10 through 17, and it says, "When thou comest nigh unto a city to fight against it, then proclaim peace unto it. And it shall be, if it make thee answer of peace and open unto thee, then it shall be that all the people that is found therein shall be tributaries unto thee, and they shall serve thee. And if it be, or if it will make no peace with thee, but will make war against thee. Then thou shalt besiege it, and when the Lord thy God hath delivered it into thine hands, thou shalt smite every male thereof with the edge of the sword. But the women and the little ones and the cattle and all that is in the city, even all the spoil thereof, shalt thou take unto thyself, and thou shalt eat the spoil of thine enemies, which the Lord thy God hath given thee. Thus shalt thou do unto all the cities which are very far off from thee, which are not of the city of these nations, but of the city of these people, which the Lord thy God doth give thee for an inheritance. Thou shalt save alive nothing that breatheth, but thou shalt utterly destroy them, namely the Hittites, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites, as the Lord thy God hath commanded thee. Now, there's a lot in this. We're only going to talk about a few things, but we see that for the nations that inhabited the land promised for an inheritance here, they were not to be proclaimed peace to. This is the land of promise, and if they're going to inherit it, they can't be there. It's not a question of whether they're going to submit or not. It just they have to be removed. So that's why it says you save nothing alive, drive them out. But we note something else which is interesting. Of those which are very far off, we see this different process that, when you come against a city or a nation, proclaim peace to it. And if they will submit, then they'll be tributaries and they will be your servants. But if they won't submit, then you destroy them and you accomplish. Either way, they're going to take it over. And we'll find that these are the same principles that the greater Joshua is going to use. And I mean, it's not even kind of reading between the lines, it says it, and we'll see. But this is important for us because, firstly, it tells us that not every single nation is dealt with exactly the same. It's not like Christ returns and then it just begins this nonstop outrage of war that just conquers the whole earth in 24 hours. And the other thing, which is particularly helpful for us, specifically when we're trying to sort out what prophecies are relating to what, is we see that nations are referred to in different ways. And I have a knack for not keeping up with my slides, so forgive me for that. But we see in this passage itself, we see people that are far off and also those that are near to them. And we see this more clearly in chapter 13 of Deuteronomy, where it says, namely of the gods of the people which are round about you, nigh unto thee, or far off from thee, from the one end of the earth even unto the other end of the earth. So here we have scriptural definitions for the terms roundabout and far off. Roundabout means nigh to Israel. Far off means from one end of the earth to the other. So geographically speaking, these are what we would call the nations round about. They literally surround Israel and they're nigh unto them. And these are scripturally nations which are far off. One's a very specific number of nations and one's a lot because it's the rest of the planet we're talking about here. So it's awesome to have these scriptural definitions because a lot of these prophecies tell us which ones are being defeated at these certain times. And I think this is particularly something that was, or at least for the many things I've read, not taken into account with some of the earlier writers, because a lot of these nations as they are today, they didn't exist back then. But another thing is we see in Deuteronomy 20 kind of the mindset of Christ. The earth will certainly have filled up the cup of her indignation. Wrath is going to be poured out. I mean, there's prophecies which say that the slain of the earth in that day shall be from one end of the earth to the other. But there's an aspect of this where it's teaching and warning the nations. God in our day now is not willing that any should perish. And we know that means that he doesn't want people to perish. He's not going to prevent them, but he doesn't want them to. And what we see in a lot of these prophecies is the same kind of thing. We can maybe say with just a shorter fuse, you could say, but not many people are going to submit to Christ, unfortunately. But we know that some will because there will be nations. The nations that rebel, it's very clear that they're destroyed. So the fact that there's nations at all tells us that some people submit to a degree. But the way we see this, and again, I'm behind on my slides. When you look at these prophecies, these are aspects which I used to just glass over without even thinking about it. But reading that passage in Deuteronomy, it helps me see what I think is the relevance of it. In all three of these different phases, as we'll see, there's this aspect that it's a process intended, and that such and such was done so that God will be known in the eyes of many nations. That's, I think, in Psalm 83. Ezekiel 38, it says that men may know God. There's a purpose to that. And I think that's to help give people evidence of this man is actually who he says he is, and he's going to do what he says he is. So don't throw your lot in with the world and rebel. And we'll see that too. And I know a lot of this sounds like we're not even touching the subject directly yet, but it's important to talk about these things. Um, and one of the other things is, that for me that really helps me sort these out is the state of Israel in each one of these prophecies. So, ironically, to go to the future and see this war with Christ and the saints, we got to actually go back in time about 100 years, because this is when we are told about the processes which have set in place, which will set the nations to rebel against Christ. There's a number of passages on this, and I would recommend turning this up if you can. Actually, it's Revelation 16, talking about the sixth vial. This is verses 12, I think, through 16. But it talks about these three unclean spirits like frogs, which go forth unto the kings of the earth to gather them together to the battle of Armageddon, basically, to fight against Christ. And what's important for us at this time is when these frog-like spirits go out. Verse 12 talks about, if you can see it here, hopefully my video is not covering up. And the sixth angel poured out his vial upon the great river Euphrates, and the water thereof was dried up, that the way of the kings of the east might be prepared. And if you look after that, that's when these frog-like spirits go out. Where am I at my Bible? There we go. Yes. So this Euphratean power, again, we could go into a lot more with that, but it's referring to the Ottoman power, because it's actually where the Euphrates starts, and this, it's kind of the core of the Turks of the Ottomans here is Turkey, and as the river goes out, so did their empire for a while. So this shrinking up of the river Euphrates is talking about the shrinking of the Ottoman Empire, and it was in decline for a while. But in 1914, with the start of World War I, it was at this stage. And I think this specific prophecy in verse 12 is talking about the events of World War I, because after World War I, the Ottoman Empire was dissolved with the Treaty of Sevres in 1920. It was given up, or its territory was divided between France and Britain. And out of that came these eastern nations, which we know today as Jordan, Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Syria. So these are the kings of the east, and these were prepared, or their way was prepared for them in the 1920s and 30s and 40s, when these nations arose. And it's interesting that since those days, exactly what the scriptures say has happened. We won't go into the weeds about what these unclean spirits are. I believe that they're the kind of principles locked up in the democratic union, or not union, but charter of liberty, equality, and fraternity, which we know since World War I, morality is taken a sharp decline, more so than it ever has in the past. So all this is to say that this process of deceiving the nations occurred or started over 100 years ago, and it's where we're at today. So that's kind of important and interesting, and helps us know what to look out for. But now we're actually going to skip forward to the return of Christ itself. And we believe one of the first places Christ is actually going to touch down on the earth is Mount Sinai. And it's important for us here to actually talk about where that is, because contrary to traditional thought, Sinai is not in the Sinai Peninsula. It's actually in, the scripture says, Arabia and Midian. Here we go. Yeah, Galatians 4:25 says this Agar is Mount Sinai in Arabia. And even in the days of Paul here, Arabia was not the Sinai Peninsula. It was what we call Saudi Arabia today, but the land of Midian in Scripture. And another way we know this is, Moses, when he fled from Egypt, he went to Midian, which is only on the eastern side of the Gulf of Aqaba here. And it was to this mountain where he saw the burning bush, and it was to that mountain that God told him, "I will bring you back to this mountain, and you in Israel will worship me here." And that's these Exodus passages. But all that's just to show that this is where Mount Sinai is. This is where we believe the judgment will take place. And it's from here that we'll see Christ and the multitudinous Christ go forth to Israel. So that's just a fascinating subject in and of itself. But on to the conquering things. Like I say, there's a lot to each one of these, but I think we can kind of break it down into three general phases. The first being that, the acquiring of the promised land itself, which will be the result of the final Arab-Israeli war. Then the kingdom will expand through the Gogian conflict. And then I think the rest of the planet is actually locked up and encompassed in this war against this Roman papal system, or Babylon and the harlot and all that. Today, obviously, we're only going to talk about this first one. We'll talk about the latter two in the next one. But to get started with this, like I said, the state and nature of Israel is central to all of these things. In the prophecies which show Christ's return to Israel, we see that they are a regathered but ignorant nation, and they are particularly in trouble with a certain set of enemies. I don't even know if we'll list all the prophecies, but there's a lot of prophecies that talk about this. Psalm 83 is a chief one. Zechariah 12 and 14 are big. Obadiah, the latter verses of Joel 3, and there's a lot of others. But like I said, the first and primary goal is to establish the kingdom in the land promised to Abraham. So, and I've got the kingdom of Solomon placed here because I believe that the land promised to Abraham is much more like the borders of Solomon than it is from the river, from the Nile to the entirety of the Euphrates. The Hebrew word used in relation to these borders of the land, it's a different word than is used for the Nile, and there's a number of other things with that. But for time's sake, suffice it to say that I believe this is more generally what was promised to Abraham here, and you'll see it, I think, with this conflict as well. But these nations that we're looking at here, these are what are called the nations or the heathen roundabout. And when you look at them in the Old Testament, they're actually called that. But it's like I said, this is a term I think that's been overlooked in the past. But Psalm 83 being a chief prophecy, it's a chief prophecy really because it tells us specifically who are these heathen roundabout, like what's their name and where are they located exactly. And if we turn over to Psalm 83, I'm going to try to read as much of that as possible. It's not a very long chapter. Honestly, I'll probably just pick and choose as we go what we read. But Psalm 83, and this is something that some people think has been fulfilled. It has never been fulfilled. I've heard some people say that it was fulfilled in 2 Chronicles 20 when Edom, Ammon, and Moab came against Israel. But there's 7 other entities, as we can see here, that were not part of that earlier conflict, and this is yet to be fully fulfilled. But let's see. Starting at verse 1, it says, "Keep not thou silence, O God, hold not thy peace, and be not still, O God. For lo, thine enemies make a tumult, and they that hate thee have lifted up the head. They have taken crafty counsel against thy people, and consulted against thy hidden ones. They have said, Come, and let us cut them off from being a nation, that the name of Israel may be no more in remembrance. For they have consulted together with one consent, they are confederate against thee." And then in these, verses 6 through 8, it lists all these people that you can see on the map here. In verse 9, though, it says kind of the judgment on these nations. "Do unto them as unto the Midianites, as to Sisera, as to Jabin, at the brook of Kison, which perished at Endor and became as dung of the earth. Make their nobles like Oreb and Zeb, all their princes like Zebah and Zalmunna, who said, Let us take to ourselves the houses of God in possession. O my God, make them like a wheel, as the stubble before the wind, as the fire burneth the wood, and as the flame setteth the mountains on fire. So persecute them with thy tempest, and make them afraid with storm. Fill their faces with shame, that they may seek thy name, O Lord, and let them be confounded and troubled forever. Yea, let them be put to shame and perish, that men may know that thou, whose name alone is Yahweh, art the most high over all the earth. Now, like I said, you'll notice, I've been putting a lot of emphasis on scripture saying heathen and people around about. This passage does not say that, but I don't think it needs to. It actually shows us these people round about just by looking at a map here. But we are actually looking at something much what I imagine like to be like the 1973 Yom Kippur War, because these people are they're to be Confederate and come with one consent. So I think we're looking at something that's a very united, or at least generally united enough for them to go to battle at the same time together, all against Israel. And one important thing we see here is this is not a war of spoil or greed. This is a war of hate and religion. Saying, let's take the houses of God in possession. Let's remove Israel from being a nation. And that's not something that can be said of some of these other conflicts. It's either struggle of power or struggle for greed or spoil. But this is religion and hate. And we know that the Arab and Muslim nations, their mantra is to push the Jews into the sea, to end the state of Israel, all that stuff. But the end of these nations I find very interesting, because it doesn't just say destroy them, it gives us examples. And if you look at all these examples, it's all taken from the book of Judges. So basically, we just have to go back and look at, what happened to the Midianites, what happened to Sisera, because whatever happened to them is going to happen to these nations. Well, the Midianites were destroyed and utterly defeated. Sisera had a tent peg driven through his head. Jabin says he was destroyed. Oreb and Zeb were killed and beheaded. Zeb and Zalmunna were also slain. So, I mean, it's talking about destruction in the fullest sense. But I think it's really interesting that these are all taken from the book of Judges. It's not like this is the only book of the Bible that shows God's judgment. And I think one of the reasons for this is going to occur, this Psalm 83 war, whatever it is, it'll take place in a similar time of the Judges, because in those days there was no king in Israel, and every man did that which was right in his own eyes. And is that not true of our day today? So, hopefully I'm not going too fast. I tend to talk pretty quick when I get excited about things. But are these things going to happen? And when does Christ appear to Israel? Then this actually gets to another important prophecy on the recognition of Christ by Israel. We remember some of his last words to Jerusalem were, "You shall not see me henceforth, till ye shall say, Blessed is he that cometh in the name of the Lord." And the meaning of that is once Christ ascended, they're not going to say it or see him anymore until they say this. And it seems kind of strange. Like, what does it make any difference if they say that or not? But if you look up that phrase, "Blessed is he that cometh in the name of the Lord," you only got to go 2 chapters back. And this is where Israel is already saying this. This is when Christ rode triumphantly into Jerusalem. The people were accepting him, and they were shouting, "Hosanna to the Son of David. Blessed is he that cometh in the name of the Lord. Hosanna in the highest." Now, Hosanna, actually, it literally means, "Oh, save." So they're saying, "Oh, save, Son of David. Save us. You are the man coming in the name of the Lord." So the meaning of this is Christ is telling them, you're not going to see me until you humble yourselves, call for me for salvation, and accept me as your king. And what we'll see is that is the result of this Arab horde coming against Israel. And one of the chief prophecies on this is Zechariah, definitely chapters 12 and 14, but we won't look at all that, obviously, for time's sake. But if you can turn over there or just read it on the screen here, we see these things. And it says, "Behold," and starting in verse 2, "I will make Jerusalem a cup of trembling unto all the people round about, when they shall be in the siege, both against Judah and against Jerusalem." So here, context is critical always. We use the term all, but very rarely does it actually mean all. It's all of something, and this in this context is all the people round about. It's not those which are very far off. And if we skip to verse 5, it says, and the governors of Judah shall say in their heart, the inhabitants of Jerusalem shall be my strength, and the Lord of hosts their God. In that day will I make the governors of Judah like a hearth of fire among the wood. See that same thing in Psalm 83, that Israel is going to be like fire, and their enemies are going to be like a sheaf. And they shall devour all the people round about on the right hand and on the left. And Jerusalem shall be inhabited again in her own place, even in Jerusalem. The Lord also shall save the tents of Judah first, that the glory of the house of David and the glory of the inhabitants of Jerusalem do not magnify themselves against Judah. In that day shall the Lord defend the inhabitants of Jerusalem, and he that's feeble shall be as David, and so on. It carries on. Now, one thing I want to note is, well, like I said, this is not every nation on earth. Gog is not a nation round about. There are a very far off nation in scriptural terms, but we know that these are these people round about them now. But verse 5, it's not translated very well in the King James, and I think the RSV and the ESV have a better rendering. And it says that the clans of Judah shall say to themselves, the inhabitants of Jerusalem have strength through the Lord of hosts, their God. So they're recognizing here that our strength is in God. It's not in ourselves. And the King James Version kind of shows the opposite kind of thing. But that's what we see in a lot of these other prophecies too. So this is when they know and see Christ. I don't think they necessarily understand his particular identity at the time, but I think they understand this is the Messiah that's saving us here. I mean, we see in verse 7 and 8, this is the Lord saving the tents of Judah and defending the inhabitants of Jerusalem, which means they need to be saved and defended from something. But as far as how the Lord appears, we have to go to other prophecies. And if you turn over to Habakkuk 3, I did not have the time I was hoping I would have. I'm gonna kind of skim this. Let me see. Habakkuk 3. This is where we read about the march of the saints, or at least some of the march of the saints. It's really interesting. I'm kind of doing it backwards now, but you can actually trace Christ's progress from Jerusalem back to Sinai. And like I said, we're kind of doing the forward order here. Where am I going? I'm talking and I'm not looking at where I'm going. Habakkuk 3. What verses do I want to read? Let's start at verse 3, because this tells us where Christ or the Lord comes from. And it says that God came from Teman, and the Holy One from Mount Paran. His glory covered the heavens, and the earth was full of his praise. In brightness was and his brightness was as the light, and he had horns or bright beams is what it says, coming out of his hand. And there was a hiding of his power. Before him went the pestilence, and the burning coals went forth at his feet. Verse 7 says, I saw the tents of Cushan in affliction, the curtains of the land of Midian did tremble. So here we're talking about Midian again. But we want to go up to verse 12 now, where it says, Thou didst march through the land in indignation, thou didst thresh the heathen in anger. Thou wentest forth for the salvation of thy people, even for salvation with thine anointed. Thou woundest the head of the house of the wicked by discovering the foundation to the neck. In 14, it says, You'll strike through this with his staves the head of his villages, which is interesting because when you go back to Psalm 83, we see a stave driven through somebody's head, and that's how these nations are destroyed. So, long story short, Christ is coming from these southern regions, going forth for the salvation of Israel. And we can kind of see the direction that he's traveling here. Point being that Christ's first point on the earth is not the Mount of Olives. That's his first point in Israel in appearance to the Jews. But I find that he's on the earth already, coming from these southern regions. Let me see what I want to trim here. Another passage on this. Well, actually, Zechariah 14:5 shows him on the Mount of Olives. And if you look that up, I don't know if I've got it in here or not. It even says that, "And the Lord my God shall come and all the saints with thee." This is showing that when he's in on the Mount of Olives, he's already got his saints with him. So that means that they must have been gathered and judged and everything already. So another passage kind of connecting Midian and the Mount of Olives here is Isaiah 63. And this is where we get Basra, and it kind of gives you the midway point here. The point with this is the first 6 verses. It just says, who is this guy coming from Edom? Uh, his garments are stained with the blood of his enemies. He's mighty to save. Again, it's all the same things we're seeing. It's coming to save Israel. He's destroying the enemy along the way, and that's why his blood or his garments are stained with blood. So I think, Israel's in distress with these Arab armies coming against them, and that's when Christ comes to their salvation, destroying the enemy on the way to their help. Um, now, interesting. This might be something I skipped. It does say, of the people there was none with me, and many people look at that and think, well, they can't have Christ and the saints because this just says there's nobody with me. But I think this is just showing that this is using the commander name. If you read how Israel conquered the land before, many times, and most of the time actually, it just says, and Joshua took Makeda and he slew all the people, or he did this. And we know that's not just Joshua, that's just the military name, and all of his soldiers are kind of lumped under him here. And I think the same's here too. It's of the nations, of the carnal nations, none are assisting Israel, showing that it's only Christ and his redeemed as the multitudinous Christ that are saving them here. But what's interesting, and this is where the sword figure comes from, if you look at Revelation 19:11 through 15, it shows Christ and the saints, this multitude behind him, on these horses going forth to smite the nations. And out of this man on the white horse, there's a sword coming out of his mouth, which shows, he's speaking war. But when we read about the saints in Psalm 149, it talks about, let the high praises of God be in their mouth and a two-edged sword in their hand to execute vengeance on the heathen and punishments on the people and binding their kings and so on. So, Christ is speaking war because the sword's in his mouth, but the saints are carrying it out because the sword's in their hand. They're the one executing it. So I thought that was a pretty interesting thing. There's a couple other verses on that. But basically, nobody else is helping Israel except for the Lord is redeemed here. In 14, like I said in Zechariah, it just shows Christ in Jerusalem, and it says the Lord my God will come and the saints. But all these things are kind of summed up in Obadiah. This whole conflict in the aftermath. Obadiah 1, starting in 17, says, "On Mount Zion shall be deliverance," which means something needs to be delivered. "And there shall be holiness, and the house of Jacob shall possess their possessions. And the house of Jacob shall be a fire, and the house of Joseph a flame, and the house of Esau for stubble, and they shall kindle them and devour them." So, we've seen that in all these other prophecies. Israel's fire, these heathen round about are stubble and going to be consumed quickly. "And there shall be none remaining of the house of Esau, for the Lord has spoken it." And what's really cool is in the latter verses, tells us which lands are inhabited and what the result of this war is. "And they of the south shall possess the Mount of Esau, and they of the plain, the Philistines," and so on. And it's just showing us, where these people are inhabiting now. But the last verse says, "And saviors shall come up on Mount Zion to judge the Mount of Esau, and the kingdom shall be the Lord's." And the word judge, it means, it's executing judgment. So I think when it says saviors, this word literally means freed ones. And I think it's referring to those who are very recently freed from sin and death. The saints execute judgment on Esau, and the kingdom is therefore the Lord's. Not the whole earth, but the kingdom proper itself. So to get to the nitty gritty, some of these things, what is the result of this conflict? I might actually be okay on time considering we started about 10 minutes late. if I need to stop, please interrupt me. That's one downside with Zoom and stuff. But what is the result of this conflict as explained by Scripture? There's a number of things. I'm going to just sum it up in three. And one is that Israel is greatly increased with riches. In Zechariah 14:14, it tells us, "And Judah also shall fight at Jerusalem." So, once Christ and the saints come, it seems like Israel is allowed to have some kind of um, exacting revenge on their enemies here. But the wealth of all the heathen round about shall be gathered together, gold and silver and apparel in great abundance. Again, it's not the gold or the wealth of all the eight nations of the earth. It's all of these people that's gathered. Isaiah 33:20 through 24 is a really cool one. I'm forgetting the particular details of that one, but it's also late and my mind's not working that good. But that's a great one. You see some interesting details with that. Zechariah 2:4 and 5 is an interesting one as well. This says, "Run and speak to this young man, saying, Jerusalem shall be inhabited as towns without walls, for the multitude of men and cattle therein. For I, saith the Lord, will be under her a wall of fire round about, and will be the glory in the midst of her." So, um, you know, cattle is kind of a symbol of wealth back then, and I don't think what people are going to be desiring this day and age are cows, but I think it's showing this is, Israel's grown because of the amount of riches. Um, the probably one of the most important things is that Israel, as a result of this conflict, dwells safely and actually safely. The Hebrew word used in application to Israel's safety, really, when anytime it's appearing with Israel, is this Hebrew word betak. And we'll look at this more in the next class, but this is the one thing that I asked, the question I asked that led me to my current understanding of, when is Israel safe? What brings that about? And that kind of set me on all these things that help me at least sort these from one another. But whenever we look at these passages that say Israel is safe, we see that it's always a result of judgment being executed specifically on these heathen round about and Christ dwelling amongst them. They're not separate. These are one and the same thing, but both of these result in this safety, which makes sense. I mean, when you look at the lack of Israel's safety ever since they've been a nation again, because these thorns and briars that they failed to drive out of the land again. Every day I get numb to, how many stabbings and bombings in Israel. It's just commonplace now. But that won't last forever. But as far as, how the scriptures describe this, Zechariah 14, we've been talking about that a lot. A few verses after it talks about the Lord my God and the saints coming, it says, "And men shall dwell in it," talking about Jerusalem, "and there shall be no more utter destruction, but Jerusalem shall be safely inhabited." So this same word, betach. Ezekiel 28 is a really interesting one because it shows another name for these nations. When they failed to drive them out the first time, God told them, if you don't drive out all these inhabitants, they're going to be thorns and briars in your sides because you're not doing what I told you to do. That obviously happened. That's who they had all their wars with. And the same thing happens now. And it's interesting too, when Israel was cast out, the land brought forth these briars. It's talking about these other people that kind of came in. But in Ezekiel 28, 24 through 26, it just talks about when there is no more pricking briar to the house of Israel, nor grieving thorn that are around about them, that despise them. So here we see this despising and this hatred aspect here. And they shall know that I'm the Lord. And 25 just says, when I gather them from all the people, which is, at least in large part been somewhat accomplished, and I have sanctified them in the sight of the heathen, then shall they dwell in the land that I've given, and they shall dwell safely therein, and build houses and plant vineyards. Yea, they shall dwell confidence when I have executed judgment upon all those that despise them round about them, and they shall know that I'm the Lord. So it's almost impossible to point out the ties between all these different prophecies of that. This one shows the hate, this one also shows the roundabout, and it's kind of the same for all of them. But it's out of two or three witnesses, every word shall be established. And there's a lot of witnesses with this, thankfully. Um, Another passage, I'm going to talk about this one a lot for time. Um, just talks about my servant David feeding them and being their shepherd. And David's a prince among them. Um, and then Israel dwells safely. And then these places round about, they won't be a curse anymore. It will be a blessing, as it says. Um, and the main one, and this is the first one I found that kind of helped me sort some things out, is Jeremiah 23, 5 and 6. It's basically verbatim in chapter 33, 15 and 16. But it says, the days come, saith the Lord, that I will raise unto David a righteous branch, and a king shall reign and prosper, and shall execute judgment and justice in the earth. In his days Judah shall be saved, and Israel shall dwell safely, or Betach. And this is his name, where he'll be called the Lord our righteousness. And this was huge for me because it showed me Israel's safety is a result of being saved. It's not something that exists now before Christ returns. It exists because Christ returns and is in the land. Which told me, I used to think that Gog was the first thing to happen. This told me that it can't be because they're saved, then they're safe, and then Gog happens. And I'm getting ahead of myself here, but the last thing, and obviously I promise we're getting close to wrapping up. Israel is disarmed, and it seems kind of interesting, but there's no question about it. Again, Zechariah, I mean, there are obviously other prophets that talk about a lot of things, but Zechariah's just got a lot on this particular conflict and the results of it. This says, verses 9 and 10 in chapter 9, rejoice greatly, O daughter of Zion, shout, daughter of Jerusalem, behold, thy king cometh unto thee. He's just, having salvation, and so on. Riding upon an ass and upon a colt the foal of an ass, which is interesting because that's when they said, blessed is he that cometh in the name of the Lord. So this is the same person who rode on the ass and the colt the foal of an ass before. He's coming again. And it says that I will cut off from the chariot from Ephraim, and the horse from Jerusalem, and the battle bow shall be cut off. He shall speak peace to the heathen, and his dominion shall be from sea to sea, from river to the ends of the earth. Now, chariots, horses, battle bows, I mean, those are the tanks and the guns and all these things of modern day. They didn't have that back then, but all of these were instruments of war. And these are going to be cut off because they don't need them anymore, as we'll see. We'll actually see right now. We already read this verse, but it's really helpful in lots of respects. This is the one that said, they're going to be a town without walls because of the multitude of men and cattle, but not just because of how much riches they have, but it says you're not going to need any more defenses or weapons because I, saith the Lord, will be a wall of fire round about. So just like when they were coming out of Egypt, they were before the Red Sea and Pharaoh was about to take them again, that fire came down and protected Israel. It's the same kind of imagery we're seeing here, and it's just incredible. But many may wonder what will bring about these conditions that we find in Ezekiel 38. That Israel is rich. They don't have any bars or gates. They're without defenses. They dwell safely. And some say that it exists now. I can't see it. It betrays the very meaning of the word safety, particularly with the way the scriptures use it in relation to Israel. But I think as we can see, the scriptures answer this in many places as long as we look for it. This is Israel's situation after the Psalm 83 war. We just talked about it. Israel's increased with riches. They're safe, disarmed, without defenses. And when we come to Ezekiel 38, this is the condition that entices Gog to come down. Israel is greatly increased with riches. It talks about this very clearly. Israel dwells safely. It emphasizes this in many ways. Israel is disarmed and without defenses. Again, they have no bars or gates. There's those that dwell safely. They've gotten cattle and goods and gold and silver and all these things. I mean, all the same things that they actually took from these Arabs, that's what Gog is wanting. And we won't look at that, but mentions cattle, mentions gold and silver and other things. I mean, it just blows my mind personally. But if we look up these factors and ask, where does the scripture show them getting this, if it does at all, this is what we find. At least I find. And it's really beautiful because we were talking about these world events impacting one another. We see a very natural cause and effect here. And I think Gog is one of the nations that is deceived by these frog spirits, and I think the false prophet, the Pope himself. But this is creating the desire for spoil and seeing that Israel doesn't have any defenses anymore. And I think the world is horribly ignorant of many actual facts of about Christ. I think they know that some Jewish guy who's claiming himself to be king is ordering all these people to do these things. But from what we can tell from our satellites, there's no more defenses, and they got a lot of stuff that they have no right to, and we want to take it basically. So um, we'll discuss a lot of these things in the next class. But what's interesting too, let me point this out real quick. When we look at the Ezekiel 38 Confederacy and the Psalm 83 Confederacy, there's no overlap at all, which was another thing that I found to be evidence that these are separate conflicts, one happening after the other. Because if Turkey was part of the first one, they just, if they're destroyed, how are they in the second one? But there's no overlap. And another note on all these things kind of working together. Turkey, we just saw, I think in the last week, Erdogan has been calling for Russia, Iran, and Sudan to form an alliance because of what's going on with Israel and these nations here. So we see that with the conflict with Israel and these roundabout nations is helping create this confederacy of Ezekiel 38. It's beautiful beyond words. But we'll close this with a concise summary of what's going to happen from here on out. At the stage we're at right now, and I drew this with my mouse, so it's terrible, but I think these are approximately the borders of Christ and the kingdom. But as Isaiah 9:7 says, of the increase of his government and peace there shall be no end upon the throne of David, upon his kingdom, to order it and to establish it with judgment and with justice from henceforth even forever. The zeal of the Lord of hosts will perform this. And basically, what it means is once Christ is on the earth and his kingdom expands, it is never shrinking. There's no end to the increase or peace of this government. So it's going to expand outwardly from there, and that's what we'll get into in these next classes. And that's, the end of that is, the earth being filled with the knowledge of the Lord as the waters cover the sea. And so we won't really have time to talk about the kingdom age much itself beyond the conquering, but as you can imagine from the things going on right now with Israel and these nations, particularly Iran, is kind of the puppet master of a lot of these Psalm 83 nations. There's a lot of exciting things going on right now. So I don't know exactly what time we started, but I feel like I left a few minutes if we're going by time frame, is not strictly time. But that's all I got for you today.